Let's talk about jobs in prison. My name's Jesse and I spent 19 years in the Virginia prison system. And over those years, I always had a job. There might have been a few days or weeks or months when I got somewhere and I was trying to get a job or I couldn't, but I always had a job because it meant something to me. And I know there's a lot of talk about work in prison and whether it's moral or ethical. And in some of those places, like down in Louisiana or Mississippi, where you have people like hoeing fields that used to be slave plantations and not getting paid and not even getting extra food or good time, like that to me seems to be really problematic. But work was really meaningful to me because it gave me a sense of like agency and it gave me a sense of my own potential, because coming into prison, I had no sense of hope or no sense of self or no sense that I could do or accomplish anything. And some of the jobs didn't really further that. So a prison runs on prison labor. Like that's just it. The cooking, the cleaning, the maintenance, the trash, everything is done by prisoners. And some of that can be empowering, some of that can actually be demeaning. And you see somebody in the kitchen being told to serve food that really shouldn't be served to anybody, or something that's out of date and being told to be fired if they don't, yeah, that's not helpful. Like that's not a healthy environment. Where I worked maintenance and I learned new skills and I was able to tackle challenges and I was the one who was getting called to fix things because nobody else knew how to do it, like that gave me a sense of hope moving forward. That made me feel like there were things I could do when I got out of prison. So I want to go over all the jobs that I had. When I first got to, well, let me start with the jail. I couldn't have a job in the jail until I was sentenced, and then after I got sentenced, I could have moved to the trustee block, which is where you essentially do the same thing. You do something for the jail. You work in the kitchen, or you work cleaning the hallways, or you do some kind of job, but at the same time, like back when I was in the jail, they didn't pay anybody, and the only thing it would give you is they would like give you increased access to things. Like I think they had like a PlayStation in the pod or something, but that just ended up with so many guys getting their heads smashed open over the PlayStation, it didn't make sense. So I couldn't work in the jail. When I was at receiving, they would only give certain jobs to people who didn't have any money. That was actually a great way to do it because they had so few jobs and you had guys coming in, like I had help from home, so I had family money and it didn't make sense for me to be getting a job that would take money away from somebody who didn't have anything else. So I thought it was a good idea. I got to Nottoway, my first major prison, and I put in applications for everything, to be a houseman, to be a tutor, to be anything. And the only one that came through, my counselor came in the pod and said, hey man, like I've gotten like 50 applications from you. Like what's going on? He said, have you ever thought about working in the wood shop? I was like, man, I don't even know if I put one in, but I'll give you one right now. I gave him an application. Like 2 days later, they called me down there, gave me the job. It may have helped that I had done construction and different work when I was on the street, but I had a chance to go do something. Now, the wood shop honestly was not the best place. And that's actually where I moved in with the cell with the serial killer, because he was a little old man that when they popped the door, I said, oh yeah, at least he's, an old guy who's going to be quiet and decent. It's a long story, but so I got into the wood shop. First assignment they gave me was edge banding. So when you have those like pressboard tables or chairs or pressboard material, and they have to put like a laminate around the edge of it, like a plastic cover, that was my job, was literally to run the machine, run it through, and then scrape off the excess. So I had a little block of wood that had like a sharp edge, and I had to scrape it off, run it through the machine, scrape it off, and just basically stack pieces of pressboard, day after day. That wasn't really my dream because there wasn't a lot of variety, there wasn't a lot of challenge. So as soon as I got a chance, I moved to what they call the rough wood department, which is where we brought in the untreated lumber, just like a wood, a log or whatever, and we would cut it down, and we had a saws, we had a planer, we had everything to do to turn it into finished wood. So this was for some of the higher end stuff. This wasn't just like the base material. So we would do that, and then we would, put out the finished wood to somebody else who would do it. That was okay, but a lot of days it was still, pushing 1,000 boards through a planer or doing 100,000 cuts on a chop saw or, whatever the numbers are. So it wasn't really satisfying. It wasn't my thing. So I had the opportunity to go to fabrication, where we did basically R&D. So we would do specialty projects. We got an order for a table that wasn't a production table, that didn't have a set jig or a set production. We would do it and we would design it. And they would come to us and be like, hey, we've got a client who wants 100 of these. Like, what's the best way to do it? So I got to design tables. And we had somebody who wanted a pressboard table, but they didn't want plastic around it. They wanted wood around it. So we had to try to figure out if we could cut strips of wood and bend it using steam and wrap it around and seal it with glue. And so it was actually a really meaningful job, and I really liked that. I got in trouble because I got into a fight and they locked me up, but they didn't give me a charge, but I came out and they wouldn't give me boots. Now you have to have boots to go to the wood shop. Technically you're supposed to have boots for any job in a prison, but you have to have boots. They will not let you in the wood shop if you don't have boots. And the laundry guy kept saying, well, I gave you boots, I'm not giving you more. I'm like, dude, when I went to the hole, they didn't give them to me. What do you want me to do about that? He said, well, that's not my problem. So I went back and forth, and finally I literally lost my job because the laundry guy wouldn't issue me more boots. And this was when I was fairly early on and didn't realize I had to raise hell and go up the ladder and do that. I was just thinking this guy's got to see reason. He can't be this crazy. He's going to make me lose my job by not giving me the boots that I didn't lose, that some officer didn't pack up. But anyways, that was my kind of struggle, my crazy thing back and forth. And then I got a houseman job, which is just a general term for a job anywhere in the pod or in the building where you're cleaning the stairs, or you're cleaning the showers, or you're cleaning the windows, or whatever. You're just cleaning some part of the common area. Like I did floor stuff for a while. I was the floor buffer. So I learned to strip and wax the floors, learned to buff it, learned to work on that, and they would actually call me to other buildings to do that. And that ended up being a valuable skill because as I went to other places, they were always looking for good floormen. So I had that job for a while. Then when I finally got that I was kind of happy with is I got a painting job. This was like the lowest rung on the maintenance. So you have like electrical, you have plumbing, you have HVAC, you have welding, you have all the maintenance fields. Then you have like the painters, which are considered like the lowest. But we would go in, we would paint the cells, we would paint the areas. Like every now and then we would prepare something for them to do like a mural, which was really cool. Although some prisons did that and others didn't. But it was a kind of camaraderie type job. I would go out with the guys I'd work with. We'd go meet our boss. He was cool. He would like sometimes slip us food from staff side. We just kind of went about our days and it felt good. So that was a job I had up until I got transferred to Buckingham. Got to Buckingham and that was one of those stretches where I was like, man, I got to get to a job, or I got to get a job. And talking to people there, they were like, man, I've been here for 6 months or 9 months or a year. They just don't have enough jobs. So I started putting in for everything I could. I was like, man, I got to get a good job. I got to figure out a way to do this. So I had one come up and that was called the Pod Pal, the Peer Assistance Liaison. So my job was to help people in the pod, to tutor them for their GED, to help them write letters, to help them understand forms or file complaints, or basically help them with things they couldn't do if they were illiterate or they had trouble understanding policy. And so I didn't have to do a lot of work, but I had to have a wide range of skills. So I went and I took the test. You had to do like your GED stuff. You had to do this. And then I was bilingual, so I told them that, and that was what got me the job. It was the first time I'd really gotten a job on merit, because they're like, yeah, we have a lot of Latinos, like we need somebody who can speak Spanish, this is great. So I got that job, I worked that for a little while. Same thing, except this time I guess I got into a fight, but somebody just stole off of me. This guy had like a psychotic break, it was not a good situation. I ended up getting locked up for fighting. They didn't even charge me. Like when they went back and like listened to what everybody had said, they were like, yo, this dude needs to go to a psych hospital. Like, so they didn't charge me, which I was thankful for. I came out to another pod, and I didn't want to get moved back because I ended up in a cell with a really good guy. This was Danny, who got me into martial arts and meditation and really kind of started to shape the path of my life. And so I was like, man, I don't want to go back to that other pod because a peer assistance liaison is only for that pod. So I was like, all right, cool. What else can I do? And I started putting in for jobs, and there was one open in the law library. I didn't really know anything about law back then, but I was smart enough. I was working my appeal. Like I had gone through this process, so I applied, went in there, did the interview, and the same thing. I was like, oh, and by the way, I'm bilingual. She was like, all right, well, we got to give you the job. Like you're smart, you know as much as anybody else, and you can speak Spanish. It's cool. So I worked over there for 5 years. I did everything from like check cases in and out, and, the statutes in and out, the basic kind of clerical stuff, to doing research for people, doing, researching precedent, trying to figure out what kind of path they could take for their case, or seeing if there's any precedent for like a lawsuit based on some kind of civil rights violation. The thing I'm most proud of is we had this guy who came in who had gotten this crazy charge. He'd got a possession of a concealed weapon by a convicted felon for having a knife on his belt. And it was like, okay, this could be bad, but let's look at the details. And he had like a chef's knife kit, which does not meet the definition of a concealed weapon under the Virginia statute, like from the beginning. And he says it wasn't even covered, he had his jacket off, but the cop said, oh no, you had your jacket on. So we started going through this and we started looking at precedent, and we were able to prove that the knives that he had did not meet the definition of like dirk knife or like weapon or something. So whatever it was, it didn't meet the definition of the statute. They submitted that information, proved it with the pictures from the trial, and were like, yeah, you're right. He should not have been convicted. He technically didn't commit a crime, and he was able to go home. But he had been in jail for like 1.5 years, and then in prison for however long on this charge that he shouldn't have been convicted of in the first place, which just completely blew my mind. So that was a really meaningful job, but I recognized I don't want to be a paralegal. I don't want to go back and do precedent. I don't want to that's not what I want to do. From there, I became the tutor in the plumbing class. So the part of the plumbing that everybody struggled with was the math. So my job was to get people's math skills up to the point that they could take the plumbing class. So they had this introductory thing and they had these tests, and I had to help them get basically, their algebra or their understanding of their geometry up to that point so they could then take the plumbing class. And that was actually really cool because some guys came in and it was a breeze, it was no problem. Other guys I worked with for weeks to get them to pass that test, but they needed to know the information. It wasn't like we could just kind of sneak them through. They wouldn't have been able to do the plumbing class. But from there, I got a job as a maintenance tech, and that was a job I had for the longest. It was like 7 years, maybe. I loved that job. It was really positive. And what I did was do electronics for the prison. So we did the cable TV system, we did the network system, we did the cameras, we did everything. And it was cool to be able to work on something that made a difference. Like to be called by prisoners as well as by staff to be like, yo, the TV's down, can you fix it? Or this channel's down, can you fix this? Or to be called over at night because a counselor is working late, needs to get something fixed and their computer isn't working. So I had this really meaningful job. I learned these very practical skills, learned to do coax stuff, we even learned stuff about fiber. It was an awesome experience. And on a daily basis, I was like, I had the opportunity to do something meaningful and be treated in a different way. Because it was to the point that if some random person was just walking down the hallway, they'd be like, yo, what are you doing? Like, get back to your cell, what But for me, they were like, oh, Crossman, what's up? Like, what are you fixing today? And it got to the point where I could just kind of interact more freely or move more freely, and that felt really good. And that wasn't fair, it wasn't necessarily right, but man, it was nice to be able to just go and like sometimes go into the kitchen and be like, hey, I gotta check the cameras out. Like, can y'all let me in? Go in the back and just like eat with the dudes in the back of the kitchen. Like, I got a lot of privilege and opportunity out of that, and I felt like I learned a job skill, so I was really grateful for it. So then I had to figure out, all right, what am I doing? You know, I guess I'll just keep doing this because I had the opportunity to become a mentor in the mental health pod. But to do that, I wouldn't have been able to work my hours towards my electrical apprenticeship. So I volunteered to do the mentorship, and that was a role that I had for a few years. It was really meaningful because I was able to work directly with guys, but I was able to keep my maintenance job, which was really cool because I get to continue working and getting out of the pod, whereas the other mentors, when that was their job, they were stuck in that pod all the time. And like psychologists get to go home and counselors get to go home. We were stuck in there with our seriously mentally ill guys and our mental health guys all the time. There was no break, and it was exhausting. We had guys have breakdowns. Like, it was just a difficult thing, but I got to get out every day and go to work and then come back and teach my classes or check in on my guys, and that made it a lot easier and a lot more manageable. Then I made it to the honor pod, had a single cell, life was beautiful, had my year of like peace and the best time I did in prison. And then because of COVID, you know, they weren't supposed to be doing any transfers, but they decided to send 64 of us from Buckingham to Coffeewood. Now this was because basically the ventilation system had been in violation of fire code for years, but nobody really cared. As soon as the pandemic kicked in, they started like checking airflow and checking all these measurements of ventilation, realized we were failing, threatened to like shut us down or threatened to sue. I don't know what exactly it was, but it was enough that Buckingham decided to get 64 people off there real quick. I wasn't even supposed to go. I wasn't even on the list. It's just a long story, but so I ended up at Coffeewood. So now I go from a single cell in a good situation where I worked really hard to do to a place where there are 82 of us in a big room, stacked one on top of each other, open bathrooms, like no space, no privacy. Not only that, no job. So I get there and I'm like, hey, like, can I at least teach classes? Can I at least teach this? And when I first got there, we were in like a classification block for like 2 weeks, or no, a quarantine block. So the counselor there was like, yeah, great. Like, what do you need to teach your Spanish class? What do you need to teach this class? Like, let's do it. So cool. I moved to my permanent block and I'm like, hey, I want to keep teaching Spanish and keep teaching. She's like, yeah, we don't teach classes here. Like, we don't do programs. I was like, come on, like, we're locked down. You don't have any school. You don't have any work. Like, you want me to like help guys, right? She's like, no, like, I really don't care. It's like, oh, well, that's great. Like, that's the attitude we have. Like, we have people locked in a box that are miserable and like fighting every day, and we have the opportunity to create some structured activity, and you just don't want to do that because it's like not your job. Like, I'm not even asking you to do it. I'm just asking you to help me do it. And that showed me a lot about the apathy in the criminal justice system. The person who is there to make sure we have access to services and programs is saying, no, we don't do services or programs. Like, good luck. So that was really miserable, and they came in and broke us up one time for having a Spanish class because they said it was an illegal gathering. You can't have all these people together at one spot. And I was like, this is really like a mixed priority, and it's only at a low level that you'll see this stuff. Like at a medium or high, if you're doing a Spanish class, it means you're not stabbing somebody, it means you're not getting in trouble, like they're super happy. At a low level, that's when they're gonna come in and be petty and mess with you for trying to teach people something. But so finally, I managed to get in for a job because I put in for everyone that was posted, and they needed a medical worker. What that meant was I would go over and I would clean medical, I would organize supplies, I would help the nurses with whatever they needed. So I got to get out of the dorm every day. So all of a sudden I had like a sense of kind of like self and privacy. And I went to work every day I could. Like eventually they ended up hiring somebody else and splitting the shifts. But in my mind, I wanted to get out every day. I didn't want to be in that dormitory, and I could be in the back of medical cleaning, or I could be in the back of medical organizing, or I could be stacking boxes out back, or unloading the truck, or just doing anything was really meaningful to me. And that was the last job that I had, because one day when I came back from work and I was kind of settling in, they called me in the office and they said, well, Mr. Crossman, are you sitting down? Because you're leaving Coffeewood today. You've been granted a pardon. So despite having 10 years left of my sentence, like I went home that day, and then I had to figure out what I was going to do for work outside of prison. But luckily I had this base of skills. I was able to go do carpentry for a little bit. As I learned about social media, because Courtney got to me to make an account and get on TikTok, all of a sudden, okay, well, I know how to do a little bit of this. I got to do some marketing for a company. I got to reach out, and things just kept growing and exploding and changing, and I had so many opportunities. And again, work allowed me to begin to have a sense of what I could accomplish or who I could be, or give me a sense of like agency and competency, which really meant a lot to me. So I was grateful for the experience. I think that we could do prison jobs a lot better. We could have prison jobs more about like skills and training and employability and something moving forward. But at the same time, what the state's really interested in is keeping the prison running, keeping the machine running, having somebody cook the food, having somebody clean the floors, having somebody take out the trash, so they don't have to pay for that. And while I think those things need to be done, the more kind of dignity and skill and like kind of enterprise you can help people find, the greater sense of meaning and worth they're gonna have getting out. And the more you beat people down and have them like spending all day cleaning grease traps and treating them like crap and not even feeding them extra in the kitchen, well, yeah, that's not really gonna translate to somebody being a better person when they get out. If anything, they may appreciate a job they get, but I just think that everything we do can be towards building people into better versions of themselves, more educated, more skills, more whatever, but that's not the way it works, so everybody kind of has to make a way to make it work for themselves.